So I'm going to talk more today about technology, about the history of Tesla, how we got started, and some of the technology trends that let us get started, and then also are still accelerating in the industry today. And a lot of these things, in my view, in our view, are going to have a profound impact on the overall energy industry. This is an interesting period in time. There's new technologies coming that are fundamentally changing and undermining a little bit the utility business model and causing more change in the transportation business model in general than people have seen in many, many decades. So maybe just as a recap, what is Tesla's goal? A lot of people think of Tesla just as a car company, and they think, our goal must be just to make and sell a lot of cars. But that isn't really why we got started. It isn't why we founded the company in the first place. The world has a lot of cars. We didn't really think it needed more cars. We started the company to accelerate the overall transition of the world to sustainable energy, both for transportation and on the grid. And it's a wide-ranging goal. It's a massive goal. But why we felt this was so important is largely because of the atmospheric CO2 problem. This is a graph many people have probably seen many, many times. But it's what really speaks to the urgency, in my view. Why it is important to actually accelerate this change. Why we can't just let it happen at its own pace or leave it to other governments, leave it to other companies. And it's why we felt a personal urgency to dive into this problem, to rally around it. Just recently, this graph is actually a tiny bit out of date. Just recently we've passed 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And it was a milestone that didn't get a lot of fanfare. You didn't read about it on the front page of many newspapers. But that's an interesting milestone. We can measure it in the air outside this building, in the air inside this room. This is something all around the world that has changed. And we're not going to see it go below that, most likely in any of our lifetimes. That's a pretty phenomenal and profound change. And part of why this is so relevant is because of its impact on temperature. And this is an interesting visualization that I like that a climate scientist named Ed Hawkins did. It's watching kind of the temperature data over the last little more than 100 years. And you can see it spiraling out. As you go closer and closer to the present, you can see the temperature getting hotter and hotter. And it's really interesting seeing what's happened just in the last few decades. This is sort of amazing. And if you look at it on a regular graph here, you can see it even more directly. 2016, you probably have read, the recent months this summer have been some of the hottest on record that we've ever had. We've broken records every single month. And it's a little startling and maybe a little bit alarming, I think, just how far out of the norm that is. And I don't think there's much debate at this point that this is directly linked to CO2 concentrations that have increased as I showed in that previous graph. And the reason for those CO2 increases is because of our burning of fossil fuel. These things are all sort of chained together and linked. In the energy industry, both electricity, transportation, heating, this is at the heart of that. So the energy industry has created enormous prosperity and wealth and convenience and comfort for all of humanity. This is something that's done a ton of good for the whole world. But we have this opportunity now and this sort of mission in front of us that we have to figure out how to do all the things that have made us so successful for the last century without emitting CO2. So as an engineer, to me, that's this amazingly fun challenge. We don't get too many times when we have an opportunity to reinvent an infrastructure that is so big. It's a business opportunity, it's a fun technical challenge, and that's really what Tesla was founded to dive into. So back in about 2004 is when we got started. This wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things, but the landscape in the auto industry and the energy industry was quite different back then. There were really no other electric vehicles. No one was talking about electric vehicles. There had been an early wave of electric cars that were tried in kind of the late 90s, and pretty much all had failed. And we were coming into this space at a time when this was kind of seen as a completely crazy idea. Starting a car company, doing electric vehicles in Silicon Valley, it was not something that was the normal route. And it's very hard to find investors, very hard to find supporters at all. But there was one key technical advantage that let us get a toehold and let us actually make products that were compelling. And this was the change that had happened really in the last 10 years, since the late 90s to the mid-2000s, where lithium-ion battery technology and battery technology in general had improved so much and so rapidly. And if you look at where the last really earnest attempt to build a pure electric vehicle happened, this was with General Motors, the EV1. Some people might remember that car. It was a great car. GM did a fabulous job engineering that vehicle to be extremely efficient and to make the very most that it could of the day's technology for batteries. But the best that could ever do was maybe 100 miles of range, just a little bit more. And that was just not enough for consumers. It ended up being a market failure. And the reason that the whole industry was kind of written off was because they just assumed that was the best that you could do. Technology wasn't ready yet, and people kind of forgot about it for 10 years. Well, when we came and looked at building the Tesla Roadster about 10 years later, battery technology had almost doubled. It had gone from in the range of 300 watt-hours per liter up to about 600 watt-hours per liter. So that means you could store twice as much energy in a unit of volume, and you could basically get twice as much range out of your car. So what used to be 100 miles could suddenly leap to a little over 200 miles. And that made the fundamental difference. That shift was enough to suddenly relaunch the electric vehicle movement and to start a whole shift of the automotive industry. So at Tesla, our first product, and where we got started was with a small sports car we called the Tesla Roadster. This was the first lithium-ion production car that was put out there to consumers. And there were tons of naysayers. This was a really difficult innovation to try and get to market. We were essentially at that time commercializing consumer electronics, laptop technology into the automotive sector. Most people thought this was crazy. Why would you put laptop battery chemistry into a car? Can't be safe. It should never be there. But after a lot of hard work and software and development around the battery systems and control systems, we proved that it could be very safe. It could be very robust. And this started a shift in the automotive industry. Today, if you go to an auto conference, here or on the West Coast or anywhere overseas, you'll see electric vehicle offerings, from just about every single manufacturer, whether they're plug-in hybrid, or full electric. Almost all of those are now using lithium-ion batteries because of the compelling advantages in energy density and also cost. And we didn't stop with the Roadster. Most people didn't really hear about the Roadster. We only built a few thousand of them. It was a relatively tiny volume car, but it got a toehold for us. What we did after that was much more groundbreaking. The Roadster was in some ways for us a conversion. We took an existing car and we put a battery inside of it and put an electric powertrain in it. But after that, we started from the ground up. And this is something that I think is a good lesson for the whole alternative energy industry and sustainability industry. When you're trying to convert something into a more efficient or a different technology, there's fundamental limitations. And when we were able to start from a clean sheet of paper with no existing design, we could optimize things far more. And it resulted in a very different outcome than many people expected. We literally didn't have a rule book. We'd never built a car before. So we could look at the fundamental technology of what makes up an electric car and build up a whole set of technology around that and build a vehicle around that. One interesting thing is that we built a car essentially around the battery pack. That flat sheet on the bottom of the car, that is the battery. It sits in between the wheels. It ends up making up a lot of the structure of the car. It carries a lot of weight. The whole weight of the car is really centralized very low. And that gave it incredible handling. It gives it good braking performance. And these are characteristics that any electric vehicle can have. It's not unique to Tesla. This is something that we're the only ones doing it in this way right now, but it doesn't need to be unique to us. It's fundamental that any technology, car using electric technology can end up having these same advantages. And I think the results in the Model S have been surprising to the whole industry. Most people didn't expect that this first new car from a new company would be able to compete effectively with Mercedes and BMW and Audi and brands and cars that have been around for 100 years. But fairly quickly, this vehicle rocketed in sales and popularity, and we've been able to set a lot of superlatives in the whole industry. Today the Model S is the fastest accelerating production sedan on the planet. And that's pretty amazing that new technology has gone from being totally uneconomical less than 10 years ago to being one of the fastest accelerating cars you can possibly buy today. It's also the safest vehicle, the highest safety rating of any vehicle. And that's not just related to the design of the car, it's fundamental to the technology. We don't have to have big engines in the front of the car, so the crash structures in the front and the rear can be optimized to absorb impacts much better. Also, finally, we have over 300 miles of range in this vehicle. The battery technology has kept improving year on year, and today we're having range that really rivals gasoline cars. That's not the big limitation anymore. The biggest limitation is cost. Most people don't want for more range, they don't want more performance, they don't want it to be bigger, they would just like it to be cheaper. So a lot of our work goes into how do we take the same performance and the same advantages we have in this more expensive vehicle and drive down the cost of all the basic technology that goes into it. And we also innovated a lot on some other areas that weren't focused around energy as much, but have come to be really quite important, I think, to the industry and also to our brand. And coming from Silicon Valley, to us it was sort of natural to integrate consumer electronic type technology into the cockpit of the car and into the user interface. We're sort of surrounded by companies that are doing touch displays, and whether it's in a phone or a computer or things like this. And it, again, felt natural to us to just incorporate all that into the cockpit of the car. Instead of making a whole bunch of plastic buttons and knobs and things like that, we took a very different course. Everything in the car is on a flat panel display. The whole interface from the user to the car is via touch. And also, all of that is controlled by software, which is a pretty different experience than you might have in a lot of other vehicles today. We also made the car connected, so that it has a 3G or 4G connection, depending on where you are in the world. And just like a smartphone, this is not revolutionary technology, but the car can update itself. It has software update capabilities. And we're constantly writing new software inside of Tesla, and we push updates out to the fleet of cars on a regular basis. This is something Apple does all the time, Microsoft does, Adobe does, all these other companies. You all have experienced this on your computers. But car companies haven't really embraced this model yet. Every single car will be this way. There is no question in my mind this is going to happen. The benefits are huge to both the customers, to the fleet of vehicles. We can do preventative maintenance, and it allows us to respond to security vulnerabilities incredibly rapidly. Something that happened just recently is in China we had a set of essentially hackers that basically did some work exposing a few vulnerabilities on the cars, and then published a report in a beneficial way. They published their findings, but we were able to go and write a software patch to change some of the vulnerabilities they found and send that out to the fleet of vehicles, so that we could have the problem patched over the air at the same time that they published their report on what the vulnerabilities were. And I think that's sort of what we're going to see more and more of in the future. And just maybe to spend a second on security and how that's going to play out in my view. You can never engineer these connected systems to be 100% secure. It isn't how the world works. There's going to be a constant game of cat and mouse between people that are trying to find new vulnerabilities and chipping away at the defenses of whatever people have built, and then the companies that built those systems responding, adding patches, modifying the defenses. And I think a lot of the car companies and even energy industries still tend to view this as kind of a hardware thing, where you build a brick wall and then you sort of send it out there and you're done. But this is a much more dynamic game. So being connected and being of the mindset that you're going to constantly be fixing vulnerabilities, responding in a dynamic way to the outside world is a pretty important way of thinking about connected systems and how to maintain safety and stay current. Another thing that is very different with cars using different energy sources, and electric vehicles are no exception, is that the infrastructure to fuel them is incredibly important. We knew this early on with the vehicles, but people, of course, have become really used to having convenience of gasoline. There's gasoline stations everywhere, diesel stations everywhere. You never really have to worry about that infrastructure. But when we were beginning with electric vehicles, taking a road trip was a huge headache. It was really a sense of anxiety for people. When you buy a car, people want to buy a sense of freedom. They want to know that they can hop in that car and drive across the country, even if almost no one ever actually does that on a moment's notice. They want to know that they could. So for us, that was a key thing that we worked to solve. And Something we started and invented called supercharging is a very fast DC charge to the vehicle. So we knew that in this case, when you want to go a long distance outside the vehicle's range, you had to find a way to charge quickly. If you have to go and then wait overnight, that doesn't really work. A trip across the country would take weeks because you're stopping overnight every single time to charge. So we've pushed the power of charging, all the way up to about 120 kilowatts and increasing beyond this soon. But this is about a 30-minute charge on a typical experience for customers. And we also realized that this was fundamental to the value of the car. I think there's been a bit of a chicken and egg approach in the industry to date where a lot of car makers kind of see the infrastructure problem as someone else's to worry about. Car makers don't typically build infrastructure today. They sort of say, well, that must be a government problem, or that's maybe an energy company problem. Perhaps utilities should build it, or maybe oil companies should build it. But really, none of those people are stepping forward. They're all waiting for a fleet of cars, and they're sort of watching and waiting. And we just said, this is really broken. We have to have this infrastructure. It's core to our product. So we just jumped in and started building this and leasing our own spaces, signing up our own utility meter systems, and building the hardware and deploying it. And today in the US, this is what the map roughly looks like. You can drive coast to coast, up and down both coasts. We have customers that take delivery of cars in California and then happily drive them back to Colorado or even on the East Coast somewhere. And they can do that more or less like they're driving a gasoline car. You can drive for 3 to 4 hours and then stop for 30 minutes and drive another 3 to 4 hours and just keep doing that. And we've very strategically spaced these stations out so that they're in the right separation and they're in the right locations where customers can use them conveniently. And being able to do that ourselves gave us a better ability to put them where they're needed. If it was kind of a government-organized activity, or if it was just a sort of commercial free market activity, the charging stations tend to cluster in not very useful areas. This is why you might see a lot of charging stations at Walgreens or at airports and things like this, and they're really kind of in the wrong places if you actually want to solve a road trip problem. So to us, this has been a strategic benefit. We're also doing this in Europe. We have even more of these stations in Europe, actually, than North America now, and in China. And again, this is not unique to electric vehicles. This is something that all alternative fuels have to embrace, and it's something I think that will be with us for quite a while as the transportation industry is moving toward new energy sources, whether it's natural gas, whether it's hydrogen. The infrastructure issue is something that's quite meaningful and important. And that battery density graph, this thing that we started off talking about that gave Tesla a toehold in the space, the fascinating thing about this is it hasn't stopped. It isn't the case that lithium-ion has just kind of plateaued and it's just not getting better. But every single year, we're seeing something around a 5% energy density improvement with lithium-ion. So when we built the Model S and X, it was about a 40% net integrated improvement of batteries from when we did the Roadster. That may not seem like a lot, but it's the biggest, heaviest component in the entire car. So a 40% improvement tends to make a really big impact on the overall performance of the car. And by the time we are doing Model 3, this technology is already getting built and designed right now, we're seeing another 20 to 30% improvement. And the key point here also is not just that we can get more range or get a lighter weight battery, but we can also get lower cost. And this is sometimes unintuitive, but today, the biggest cost in a battery are the materials that go into it. It really is proportional to how much it weighs, because you have to pay for the nickel, the graphite, the copper, the aluminum. It's those elements that go into the battery that make it up. That's where the cost exists. So when we can increase energy density, you're functionally decreasing cost. You're able to put more energy into fewer materials. So this same roadmap that's giving better and better vehicle performance every year is also driving down the cost every single year. And this is key to what allowed us to launch the Model 3 earlier this year and what's allowing GM to launch the Chevy Bolt. Many of their car makers are now diving into this and able to announce cars at much lower prices with longer range. That's fundamentally because the battery technology is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. This vehicle for us, the Model 3, is able to do over 215 miles of range for $35,000, which is about half the price of the starting price of the Model S. So you can kind of see this incredible evolution in the cost curve and the technology curve. It's a very different, evolution than you see with gasoline engines. There's nothing in today's internal combustion cars that's improving or changing at this rate. It would be sort of like, one generation of, Ford to the next, and you had twice the performance or half the cost. It's kind of unheard of. So today we're kind of at parity in my mind. We're able to compete, head to head with, performance sedans. We're beating, many of them in sales. But it won't be too many years as you keep integrating these cost and volume improvement curves where you start to see the advantages shifting to electric and shifting to these new technologies. And I think we're going to see an accelerated adoption of these things, much faster than people expect from all the different manufacturers. And again, looking at the new products that are being announced and where people are shifting their R&D, I do think you can start to see that happening in the industry. And it's also important that this isn't confined to just the vehicle. For us, we sell directly to our customers and we have a direct connection to them through our brand. They really care a lot about sustainability, and that's an important part of why they're coming to Tesla or they're buying an electric car from us. And it's also interesting that as they buy an electric car, they start thinking a lot more about their whole energy equation. More than ever before, they think of, where did my electricity come from? Was the electricity clean that I actually charged the car with, or was it just coming from a coal plant, down the road? So this has been fascinating for us to sort of get pulled further into this space, and it's also core to what we care about. We want to make vehicles and transportation sustainable. We don't want to just stop at the car and then not worry about the energy puzzle for this. So we've started expanding our product mix and starting to offer battery storage into people's homes. We've taken the same architecture of batteries that we can build in the car and adapt that to store energy for the grid. So today we have a number of different products for storing energy on the grid. One of those is at a residential level, like is shown in this little picture, where people can add a storage device into their house that can work in concert or on its own with solar and basically buffer the solar energy that comes into someone's house. And it gives you the ability to have backup power and also self-consume your own solar power that's in your house. We're installing these systems all around the world. It's a very diverse utility business model. Many of you probably know this all too well from the facilities and companies that you're working with. But we see very strong value propositions in different parts of the world where things like net metering and the ability to sell your energy back to the utility don't exist, or where that market has been really reduced because of having a lot of renewables already on the grid. So these battery systems on people's homes are helping to solve that problem and to let people keep adding more solar to their homes. We've also expanded this even to commercial and industrial sectors. As we've seen our economy of scale with batteries keep growing, as we see that expand to Model 3 and beyond, the price per kilowatt hour of energy storage has reached a point where it's now compelling and really quite economic to store energy at commercial facilities in order to shave off peak demand. And again, this is probably something a lot of you guys think about or talk about, but it's only possible in just the last few years. This is really quite a new development. And these battery packs in this picture are using essentially that automotive architecture, the same type of power electronics and controls, but packaged in a way that they can basically connect to the grid behind the meter at a commercial site or an industrial site, and then work in concert with that building to moderate the peak demand charge and save the customer money. So we're doing sites like this all around California, at large retail stores, at industrial sites, at wineries, at things like this. And it's expanding quite fast. There's a number of startup companies in California, more than I can count on both hands, that are diving into this as well with different technologies or control strategies or software packages. So it's quite a vibrant and exciting space. But all of it is being driven by the fundamental economy of scale happening on lithium-ion battery technology. And that's pulled by vehicles and pulled by a rapid increase in how many of those batteries are being made and sold in the world. And this doesn't have to stop behind the meter. These sites are also going to utility scale. This is a rendering of a site that's under construction right now in Hawaii, and on the island of Kauai, where we're doing a large battery system. It's a whole field of those battery packs, about 50 megawatt hours worth of those batteries, working in conjunction with a very large solar array. And the interesting thing about this site is that the battery and the solar work together to deliver firm energy back to the grid on this island. This is a relatively small island in Hawaii. It's a beautiful place, but their whole grid is right now driven by essentially internal combustion of diesel gensets. Large diesel gensets, but that's how they generate their electricity. And they can't just keep absorbing more solar. The energy solar can create is a lot cheaper than the energy the diesel generator can make, but it's intermittent. And you can't just sort of add this intermittent solar onto the grid and expect it to be stable. So for them, they needed storage, and they needed a way to make that whole system operate smoothly and robustly. Even if a cloud came over the island, you couldn't have the lights dim or the lights go out or the grid destabilize. So storage here was fundamental to allowing renewables to keep scaling, and all of that was offered at a price below the cost of the fossil fuel energy, which is pretty compelling. Even with the storage, the solar plus storage, there was a contract that was cheaper than adding more diesel gensets. So this island is continuing to scale this up, and we're seeing this happen all around the world at places that have a higher electricity cost, or they have a long logistics trail to import the energy, fossil energy, to run those grids. The other place that I see this as really exciting, where there's incredible change happening, is in the developing world. And the whole infrastructure for energy there is not going to be built out in the same way that we built it out here. It doesn't make sense to rebuild a giant central generation network and distribution network with the vulnerabilities and with the environmental impacts that has, and also just with the huge cost. There's a giant infrastructure cost to transmit and distribute electricity. And we can do that much cheaper right now, especially if you're starting from scratch. So kind of back to how we thought of designing the Model S, when you're looking at a clean sheet of paper, it's lower cost, it's more resilient and more environmentally friendly to look at a much more distributed grid that can have much higher renewables penetration, more storage, and not have the same reliance on moving bulk energy long distances between major centers of load or consumption. So this is, I think, the best analogy for me is looking at communication. If you go and look at India or parts of Africa, there isn't, people aren't building out landlines for telephones. That seems ridiculous. Why would you bother pulling a landline telephone when everyone has cell phones? Cell phones in those parts of the world that didn't have a land-based communication infrastructure totally leapfrogged and made obsolete the need to build a landline network. And I think that's the same thing that we're seeing starting to happen with energy in those same regions, where a distributed, more renewable network is going to leapfrog the very centralized and very fossil-centric network of energy. And eventually, that will also migrate back to places like right here in the center of the US, but that will take a bit more time. And ultimately, our goal and our vision for this might be controversial to many people in this room, but we have to find a way to get to 100% sustainable energy. The CO2 rate of increase is not going to stop until we stop burning fossil fuels. To me, it's sort of sometimes kind of crazy that we think about just reducing our rate of increase slightly. It'd be like if we found ourselves in a hole and then we kind of were digging and we decided, well, maybe we should just not dig quite as fast. That's really not the right response when you realize that you're in a hole and getting deeper. Eventually we have to completely stop digging and we have to stop pushing more CO2 into the atmosphere. That might seem obvious, but the implications of that are pretty extreme. And if you look at just what kind of solar area it would take to do this in the US, this isn't how this is going to evolve, obviously. We won't have one giant solar panel somewhere in the middle of Nebraska. I think that's in Nebraska, or actually Oklahoma, perhaps. Kansas, sorry about that. Hard to see where it is. But we'll have this distributed all throughout the country. And we'll have a balance of solutions. There will be wind, there will be perhaps nuclear and other low CO2 technologies. But we have to eventually get to a place where all of our energy needs are not being met by things that release more CO2 into the atmosphere. And it's very doable. The technology exists to do all of this. It's just going to take the sort of will of people to start to understand, how those technologies dovetail into their own products and their own facilities. And overall, this kind of, to me, is an interesting quote that sort of sums this up. But this sort of won't be, driven by fear of running out of petroleum. It's not going to be fear of running out of natural gas or coal. The world has huge amounts and huge reserves of fossil fuels. More than I think we can, reasonably expect to consume from an environmental impact point of view. But also, the technologies that are competing with these things are improving at such a rate. Batteries are improving at a fast enough rate, solar power is improving, wind energy is getting cheaper, such that these new alternatives are going to be more compelling way before we get to a place where the existing fossil resources are running out. You can already see that starting to happen, with solar power in many parts of the world and electric vehicles in some parts of the world as well. So to me, it's an optimistic story that's going to be pulled by new technology and new products that have compelling value propositions to customers who just really want those attributes more than they want the attributes of the old technology. So with that, I'll wrap it up and leave a little bit of time for us to have a discussion at the end. So thank you.